All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. So this talk is I have about 30 slides, and it's sort of a conglomeration of a couple different talks that I've given before. And so we're going to look at a variety of things. I have experience growing herbs at the kitchen garden and then at my home garden. And then I worked with a master gardener and a cook, Rosemarie Serena, for a couple years at UT Gardens, and we taught some classes together. So the slides on preservation are really from my work that I did with Rosemarie. So let's just get started. And the first thing that we'll just look at is like an overview of everything that we're going to talk about. So just really briefly, I'm going to look at how to grow, some basics about site selection, talk a little bit about sun exposure, soil. We have a slide on irrigation and fertilization. And then I want to talk about propagation, just in terms of, we have all these different standard herbs that we think of as culinary herbs. So like, how are we going to get those in our garden? What's the most common way to propagate them or to grow them? So we'll look at seed, the herbs that grow really commonly from seed, division, cuttings. And then I want to look specifically at some of the really common, popular, good culinary herbs that I've grown, and we'll talk some about the different varieties that I've experimented with. And then we will look at preservation, and there's a few different methods for preservation that we'll look at. So site selection, herbs in general are going to want full sun. However, many herbs will tolerate part shade. Rosemary, like we have in the picture here as an example, when you grow them in the shade, you're gonna have longer stems. It's not gonna be as compact and bushy. They have a tendency to get they like are reaching for the sun, so the stems get longer, and the flavor tends to be more mild in the shade. Soil herbs are great because for the most part they are really easy to grow, so they will thrive in a lot of different types of soil. The key is to have excellent drainage, so especially with the perennial herbs that are, you're wanting them to overwinter, like lavender and rosemary, getting them to make it through the winter, the really, really big key is having excellent drainage. So if we get like a really bad cold snap and the roots are, are sort of stuck in frozen ice because you don't have good drainage, that can mean sure death. So make sure that you've got quick draining soil. You can do this with raised beds. Herbs are great candidates for containers. That's a great way to control the soil. They work well with all types of potting soil. So really, really easy to grow. The main thing is to provide some sun and to provide excellent drainage. And other than that, in general, I'd say herbs are some of the easiest plants we can grow. So a little bit more about irrigation, or I guess I talked about sun before, but so irrigation, let's think about that. So there are a lot of different plants that we call herbs, and so they're not going to be all the same, but generally we can look at the woody herbs as a group, and those really don't like to be overwatered. So I just talked about that with the quick draining soil. So probably you're not going to need to have them on irrigation. And similarly to sun exposure, the amount of water that you give herbs can affect the flavor intensity. So if you have good drainage and you've got them on an irrigation system, that can actually make the flavors become more mild as well. So you just want to pay attention to the soil moisture. So, saying something does not like to be overwatered doesn't necessarily mean that it likes to, that you don't ever have to water it, you know? So like with rosemary, you want to let it dry out between watering. So it doesn't want to be soggy wet, and you don't want to never water it like a cactus. So just check the soil moisture on a regular basis and allow it to dry a few inches below ground, and then water deeply. So this is similar to a lot of different plants. It's kind of a rule of thumb with, I'd say, a broad range of plants that we grow, is that you want to let it dry out for a little while, and then you want to water really, really deeply. And then you want to let it dry out for a little while and then water really deeply. Fertilization, generally speaking, those woody herbs like the rosemary, the lavender, the marjoram, thyme, they're probably not going to need fertilizer. But the herbaceous herbs like your basil and parsley and cilantro to some extent, you know, those have large leaves, especially like the basil. You want those nice big lush leaves, and so those will benefit from more fertile soil or from the addition of some fertilizer to your containers or to your beds. And if you're growing your herbs in containers, don't forget that you are in control of the fertility, and so you really do need to put some fertilizer in. You can get away with growing a lot of the woody herbs like rosemary and lavender without fertilizer, even in a container. But if you really want them to bush out and be lush and gorgeous, then you really need to add a little bit of fertilizer in a container situation. So, okay, so what are the plants that we grow from seed, the herbs that we grow from seed? These are going to be like your annual and your biennial herbs. So annual means life cycle completes in 1 year. So obviously we're going to need to restart those every year. And then the biennial life cycle completes in 2 years. So we need to restart those often as well. And so as a general rule, a lot of these types of herbs are good candidates to be grown from seed. So this is going to be like your basil, like you can see growing in this cool time lapse I got here. Those are little baby basil seedlings. So they're easy to grow from seed. They grow fast from seed, and it's an inexpensive way to propagate them. Dill is another good candidate for seed production. Parsley is a biennial, and that's one that I grow it from seed in my garden, and then it usually overwinters. And so then the following year it sends up flowers and it makes seed, and then I just let those seeds fall to the ground and just start the cycle over again. So I'm able to keep parsley going in the garden all the time by doing that. But I'm also, like this year at the kitchen garden, we've got all of our parsley from last year it's overwintered and it's starting to flower now. But I also want parsley to be able to harvest this year. So I actually have 2 different cycles going. So we've got the parsley that's flowering now, and then we've got the fresh parsley plants that are being planted that we started from seed in the greenhouse. So they're at a different phase of their life cycle, so we can have both stages happening at one time. Cilantro is another one. You got to grow that from seed. It's one that doesn't like to be transplanted, so it's really best to just start that from seed straight in your garden bed. Summer savory is another example of a common seed grown herb. Chervil is one that's a little bit like parsley, a little bit like, I'd say it has a slight celery flavor, and it's another leafy one, annual, grown from seed. And then Mexican tarragon, this is one that we'll talk a little bit more about, but I usually buy a Mexican tarragon plant, but we did have it go to seed in the herb spiral last year, and so I have a lot of baby Mexican tarragon plants coming up right now where it reseeded itself, so I can see that it's obviously a very easy one to grow from seed. So division is another type of propagation that we can think about when we're looking at herbs, and making more herbs, growing them. And this is going to be best for fully grown herbaceous perennials. So this is going to be things like oregano, mint, French tarragon. Those are all examples of things that would be easy to divide. And that would be something that you might want to do if you've had these herbs growing in your garden for a long time, and they kind of need to be given some space, and they need to be broken up, or if you just want to add them to other sections of your garden. So just briefly, the way to do that, it's best to do it now is fine, but early spring or fall. And the way you do it is to look for a cloudy day. So you don't want it to be really too sunny, because you're digging the roots up and exposing the roots, and you don't want them to dry out. But so you dig the whole plant up, and then you just divide. You could use a knife. I've used my pruners before, but the goal is to just get a nice chunk of the root. And so when you go in to start dividing and like cutting it apart, you might have some pieces that fall off that don't have a nice root structure, and so those are not going to be good divisions. You want to really make sure you've got some top growth and a nice healthy root, and that the two things are connected. I think that's the main key with division. And then you want to cut back the top growth, and I think this is a place where a lot of people hesitate, because it's hard to want to cut back all that nice healthy growth, but you're disturbing the root system, and you're probably reducing the size of the root system, and so you really need to reduce the size of the top growth as well, because you want to have about an even amount of roots to top growth. If you have like a whole lot of pretty leaves up top and like a little bit of roots, your roots are not going to have the energy that they need to sustain the plant and to keep all those leaves alive. So take a deep breath. It's okay. Cut the top of your plant off and then replant it. And so then you're just going to either replant it in the ground or put it in a container, and then you can move it wherever you want later. But other examples of herbs for dividing are like catmint, catnip, chamomile. I wouldn't do chamomile. That's a seed-grown one. But chives are easy to divide, excuse me. And I said oregano and mint as well. So great way to share herbs with your friends. And then you always want to remember to water really, really well. Again, you've disturbed the roots. You've dug the whole thing out of the ground. So after you've cut it up into little pieces and you cut the top growth back and then you repotted it, be sure to water it in really, really well. So the third type of propagation I want to look at really quickly is cuttings. And so this is what you would want to do with some of the woody herbs. And so I made a little video. And so I'm just going to share this video. It's about 2 minutes long. And I'm going to do a demonstration of taking a cutting of rosemary. Hey everyone, I am here in my kitchen this morning and I want to share with you a method for propagating woody herbs. So this is a rosemary branch that I cut from a bush in my garden this morning. And when you're taking cuttings of any plant, you really want to stick them in rooting hormone and get them in their growing medium as soon as possible after cutting. So you just want to keep them as fresh as you possibly can. So this was just cut about 20 minutes ago, and that's really ideal. So what you want to do is to take your larger branch and cut it into a smaller size. And I'd say you want to go for somewhere between 3 to 4 inches for your ultimate cutting size. And so you want to make a nice fresh cut at the bottom of the plant. And then it's good to cut out that really soft growing tip up at the top. And so I just trim that out as well. And so I'm left with a cutting that has some softer growth at the top, but it's not really floppy, as well as a little bit of a harder, woodier stem at the bottom. The next step is to remove the lower 2/3 of the leaves. And so I like to come in and pinch them off or cut them off with scissors or a sharp knife. What you don't want to do is rip them off and strip off your bark, because that could create an entry point for disease. So be really clean about it and just cut them off really nice and tidily. So once the leaf stripping part is done, you're going to end up with a cutting that looks something like this. And so you can see it's nice and cleaned off at the bottom. You got the leaves up at the top. Then you're just going to take this and you're going to dip it into a little bit of rooting hormone.
So I have a brand here called Dip and Grow, and this is just what I happen to have on hand. There are a lot of different brands out there. I have found that they all work pretty well as long as it's, relatively fresh. There's powder and gel and liquid. This is a liquid form, and it came in a little pouch, and they included a little cup. And so you just want to pour in whatever the rooting hormone material is, and then you are going to take your cutting and you're just going to dip it in there. And then you will stick it into your growing pot. So I have a little sterilized terracotta pot here, and I've got some fresh out of the bag sterile potting medium. And you do want to use something that's sterile just because you want to increase your chances of success. So you want to minimize the potential for disease. So using some fresh sterile potting soil is ideal. And it needs to be, whatever it is that you use needs to really have excellent drainage, and you also need to provide plenty of moisture. So you take your cutting, you stick it in all the way down to right below where the leaves are, and then I'm going to water this in really, really well. And I'm going to stick it outside in a protected spot in some shade, or you could keep it indoors, but you don't want to have it in direct burning hot sun. Wait 2 to 3 weeks and you should start to see some roots develop.
All right, so those can be used.
Hey everyone,
you can do the same thing with rosemary, lavender, thyme, sage, French tarragon, and marjoram, and there are many more. So if you've never tried taking cuttings and propagating your own woody herbs from cuttings, I recommend you try it because it's pretty easy and quite rewarding. Okay, so now we're going to transition into just looking at some particular herbs. And I want to talk about basil for a minute. This is a warm season annual, so it really wants warm weather. And it's not going to overwinter for us if it's left outside. So it's going to be put out at the same time as your tomatoes and peppers. It wants warm soil temperatures and as well as air temperatures. And there are a few varieties that I love. Amazel basil is one that we just sold in the plant sale, and it's fairly new to the market. And it has a few standout attributes. One is that the Amazel basil is sterile, and so it will not make its own seeds. And the reason that matters to us if we're growing it for a culinary herb is because I'm not exactly sure how it all works, but somehow the fact that it is sterile, it helps the leaf maintain the same flavor even after the plant has flowered. So with most basils, we say we want to pinch back the flowers, cut back the flowers, because after the basil has started to flower, the flavor of the leaf becomes a lot stronger and it's not as mild and tasty. So the Amazel basil is this hybrid that really does keep more of a mild flavor even after it flowers. And then the other standout thing about the Amazel basil is it has a high resistance to downy mildew, and that's a big issue for basil in the southeast and here in Tennessee. And the Amazel basil is resistant to downy mildew. So if that's a problem that you've seen in your garden, or if you have other types of mildews, you might want to try one of this Amazel basil. There's also a few new varieties from Rutgers that are especially resistant to downy mildew, but that's a fairly new issue for basil, and so the breeding is just now catching up with that problem. But Amazel basil and the varieties from Rutgers are a few to try for downy mildew resistance. Spicy Globe is just one of my favorites. I don't have a picture of it, but it makes this cute little round ball, and it stays in a really rounded shape, so it's really cute to grow maybe like 5 of them all in a row, or use them as a border plant because it makes these perfect cute little round balls, and the leaves are really small, so it's really an ornamental one. Siam Queen Thai basil has a different flavor from your sweet Italian basil, but it's great if you like Vietnamese cooking, or if you just want to grow it for its beauty and to smell in the garden, maybe put in salads. It has a beautiful light purple flower and purple stems. And then Lane Curry Thai is another type of Thai basil, but it's quite different from Siam Queen. It's much shorter and the flowers are much shorter. So it's just like it's a fun, different shape. And then there's this Pesto Perpetuo, and that's what we have in the picture here. And this is one of my favorite basils because it's so ornamental. You can see that it's got the nice variegated leaves there. It's got the green and white leaf. And then it does not flower at all. So you never have to pinch the flowers off, and it has a pretty compact habit. And it's just a really ornamental basil that does not flower. And I will say that I like to grow a lot of different types of basil all at the same time because they have different flavors and they have different growth habits and they have different flowering habits, you know. So I've talked about some that are sterile, some that don't flower at all, and then the Thai basils, those have a lot of flowers and they are fertile and they have a lot of nectar and pollen, and they're great for attracting beneficial insects to the garden. So for me, I like to grow basil for culinary use, but I also like to grow it to attract beneficial insects. So I grow a lot of different types. Few growing tips for basil. I already talked about the fact that it really wants warm season. It really wants the warm season. So don't put it out too early. You really just have to wait. I am really tempted to put my basil out right now. And I may put it out this week, but if I were really wanting to be sure that the weather was right, I would wait until nighttime temperatures have stabilized to 50 degrees or higher, which is the same rule that you follow for peppers, eggplant, and tomatoes. You just got to wait for those nighttime temperatures to stabilize. And then other than that, the basil likes really fertile soil, and the more water and fertilizer you give it, the bigger the leaves are going to be, the more mild the flavor is going to be, and the more leaf growth you're going to get. And that's what you want, is to harvest the leaves for eating. The next herb I want to look at is cilantro. Some people love it, some people hate it. I am a cilantro lover, and it is an annual. And it can be tricky for us to grow because it doesn't like really high temperatures. And it doesn't like, it's also sensitive to day length. And so my cilantro, I think a lot of people struggle with growing cilantro, and I think a big reason is because they start growing it a little bit too late in the season, and then the temperatures heat up and the cilantro goes to flower. So if you really want to go out for the leaves, I have really good luck growing it in the fall. I have better luck growing it in the fall, and it actually overwinters for me quite often at UT Gardens. So it will tolerate quite a lot of cold. My favorite variety of cilantro is one called Calypso, and no matter when you grow it, Calypso, it's a hybrid, and it's been bred to have a delayed flowering time. So I have grown it side by side with like a standard cilantro, it wasn't a variety, it was just like the straight genus species cilantro. And I grew this Calypso side by side. I had like 15 plants of each, and the Calypso was 2 to 3 weeks longer to go to flower. So it really does stay in the vegetative stage much longer. So that's a good one to try. PJ, I see the chat thing.
It was more just a comment. Someone said that she had bought some cilantro. She likes it and had purchased some from Home Depot, but she's going to try it from seed.
Oh, nice. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And I think I think it's better to grow from seed. Also, it doesn't really like to be transplanted. So if you buy it for, pre-grown in the little pots, and then you transplant it out into your garden, that often can shock it as well, and it can accelerate the flowering process. So,
okay, good comment. We learned some more from that.
yes. Let's see. Harvesting, you want to harvest the leaves. We just sat here and talked about how we didn't want it to go to flower, but actually it's okay when it flowers. It just sort of shortens your harvest window, but you can eat the flowers, and that's a fun thing to add to salads, or just use as a garnish, is the cilantro flowers. They do have a little bit of a different flavor, but if you're an adventurous eater and you like to try different herb flavors, I really like the flowers of the cilantro. And speaking of flowers, you can eat the flowers of all these herbs that we're talking about. And so it makes sense, right? If you can eat the leaves in general, you can eat the flowers. So that's a nice way to add color and make your dishes feel a little fancy, is to use the herb flowers. And then you can also eat the seeds of the cilantro, and that is the coriander. So, and that's a totally different flavor as well. So, and also when it's in flower, it attracts beneficial insects again. So if you're thinking about pest control, or thinking about the health of your garden, maybe you can be okay with your cilantro going to flower, because it's actually you can eat the flowers. The beneficial insects like the honeybees and your parasitic wasps can enjoy the nectar and pollen, and then you can let it go to seed. And you could save some of those seeds to plant next year, or you could grind some up and eat them like coriander. So we talked about the growing tips. Prefers cool weather. So yeah, grow in spring and fall. It's a little late to be starting it right now, just because I think it is going to start warming up, but you could try starting it from seed now. And then succession sowing is good with cilantro, and that just means sowing some, and then waiting a few weeks and sowing some more, waiting a few weeks and sowing some more. And that's one way you can make your harvest window longer and be able to harvest more.
Holly, I have a question.
Yeah.
When you're talking about succession sowing, so I assume, since this doesn't really like the hot weather, there'd be a point when you would stop succession sowing, and then maybe in the fall start it up again, or not?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I like to push the limits, and so I think if you had like a spot that had like afternoon shade and you had irrigation in your garden, you might be able to grow it through the summer.
Okay.
But you would definitely want to do the succession sowing, because you might get a shorter and shorter period that you were able to harvest the leaves, because it was going to flower faster.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so the next one to look at is French tarragon, and this is an artemisia, and it is a wonderful herb. It actually, if you've never had fresh French tarragon, you should try it. It turns your tongue numb, and just kind of an interesting aside. But when you cook with it, it loses that capability. But if you're out in the garden and you have a chance to try some, I recommend it. It's pretty odd, but it's a perennial. It does not flower, so this is one that you're going to grow from cuttings or from division. And you want to harvest it in spring, because it is another one that really doesn't like the intense heat of summer. And so like my tarragon looks gorgeous right now, my French tarragon. And so now is the time to harvest it. And it works really well as you can do a tarragon vinegar. But it really just fizzles out as soon as it gets really hot outside. So you want to take advantage of it early on in the season, before it starts to fizzle out. And then in the fall, it kind of comes back a little bit, but its major glory and the best time to harvest is in the spring. And like we said, we propagate that from division. And then you have Mexican tarragon. And so these are two different plants. So you got the French tarragon, which is an artemisia, and then you have Mexican tarragon, which is, I'm never sure how to pronounce this. I want to say Tajitis. And so Mexican tarragon is related to marigold, but it is one that actually is a half-hardy perennial, meaning it's like zone 8, I think. And so it will overwinter for us sometimes in Tennessee, but it's not reliably hardy at all. So we generally grow it as an annual. But you can harvest this one all season. And so it has a different flavor from the French tarragon. And I think people, or I've heard some, cooks talk about like you can't compare the two. They're completely different. But I would let you be the judge of that. And it's nice to, once your French tarragon has gone into decline because of the heat of summer has set in, you can start growing your Mexican tarragon, and you can substitute the Mexican tarragon for the French. And I really like tarragon with beans. And so I like to pick the fresh green beans out of the garden and steam them or boil them and then serve them with butter and tarragon. But when the beans are coming in, the French tarragon is usually done. So I rely on the Mexican tarragon. Growing tips, like I said, it reseeds well. And so it's really easy to grow. And it just wants to have full sun. Okay, next one is lavender, and this one is a perennial, and there are a few varieties that we really love, that I really love. Phenomenal is one that's fairly new, and it has a good flavor. It's really sweet, and it is a little bit more hardy than some of the classic varieties of lavender. I've had some living in the kitchen garden now for 4 years, so that's pretty good for lavender in Tennessee. It's hard to keep a lavender alive for many years in Tennessee. Grosso is another good variety for culinary use. Harvesting lavender, what we use for cooking is the little flowers or the buds, and you want to harvest those. So I think you should experiment. I always want to advocate for experimenting and see what you prefer. But I like the flavor when the little buds right before they've opened. And so I like to harvest them, harvest a lot of the flowers right before they've started to open. And that's when I prefer the flavor. I think there's a subtle change once the flowers have opened all the way. But the scent is different too at those two different stages. And like I said, we use the flowers less than the leaves for culinary purposes. Growing tips. Lavender is another one that really, really, really needs good drainage. So if you can grow it on a mound, if you can grow it in a raised bed, some serious lavender growers actually mulch with gravel, and that helps keep the humidity down around the underneath the plant. If you mulch with a heavy, like a hardwood mulch, that can create too much moisture, and you don't want moisture being held around the base of the lavender plant because they are sensitive to fungal diseases, and we have a lot of those in Tennessee. So really getting allowing the roots to have the moisture that they need, but not keeping the moisture trapped around the plant is going to keep those fungal diseases down. And then lavender has to have full sun. It really does need full sun to thrive and to be happy. One of the next to the last one, parsley. I just want to talk about this real quickly because it is such a common cooking herb, and this is one that I always have in the garden. I talked a little bit about growing it from seed. It is a biennial. It is you harvest the leaves, and you can eat the flowers on the parsley as well. It's really easy to grow, and it overwinters for me. And so we're going to talk about drying it, and you can dry it, but my opinion is that it has the best flavor when it's fresh. And so if you can just grow it and try to keep it going through the winter, which you often can in Tennessee, that is preferable. And then I really like the flat leaf Italian parsley like you see here. And this is also subjective, but the flat leaf Italian has a slightly different flavor from the curly parsley. And so I encourage you to try both kinds and see which one you prefer. But there's also a higher vitamin, some of the nutrients are higher in the flat leaf Italian parsley. So try the two different kinds and see which one you like, or maybe grow both. The curly leaf parsley is better for garnishes. It's a little prettier, but for cooking and adding to salads, etc., I like the flat leaf Italian parsley. And if you are growing parsley and you see one of these little guys, this is a caterpillar for this butterfly, which is a swallowtail, I believe. And I put this on here because, yeah, swallowtail butterfly, because I had a lot of these. So I had a huge parsley patch last year, and I suddenly noticed, oh no, it's covered in caterpillars. Well, I looked up and found out who the caterpillar was, and it's a swallowtail butterfly caterpillar. So we let him go, and this summer, hopefully, we will have a lot of swallowtails. And so plant enough parsley that you can have what you need for your kitchen, and maybe you can even help the butterflies. One of the last herbs here is a rosemary. This is a perennial. This is one of those woody perennials, woody perennial herbs, easy to grow. My favorite varieties are ARP and Hills Hardy, and also prostratus, which is the kind that grows along the ground or down. You know, it kind of grows down or prostrate. But the ARP is one that is, I'd say it's the most reliably hardy, and it really is more cold tolerant. And then Hills Hardy is a great one as well. They look very similar, have very similar flavor, and those two are the hardiest, the ARP and the Hills Hardy. The prostratus is not reliably hardy for us in Tennessee. But that said, we've had some growing at UT Gardens for going on 7 years, and I think we just have found the perfect space for it. So it's on a big rock, so it gets some of the trapped heat that gets trapped in the rock. It's in the rock garden, so it's getting really good drainage. It's on a hill, so you might just experiment. If you can find the perfect spot in your garden, a protected spot, you can often get some of these less hardy things to overwinter. Harvesting rosemary, a little bit goes a long way. You don't have to use a lot. You can really harvest it anytime. And you can also dry it, and we'll talk more about that. I talked a little bit about growing tips already. It's similar to lavender and the other Mediterranean herbs, in that it wants that sharp drainage and it wants full sun. But rosemary is one that you can grow in more shade. It will take, I'd say, 4 hours of sun. You could get away with 4 hours of sun for the rosemary. And other than that, I think it's really easy to grow. And I would just say with these, you know, we talk about a herb being an annual or perennial. A lot of these perennial herbs, they may not be long, they may not live, you know, 10, 20 years in your garden, but that's okay. You should find out how to propagate them, or buy another one and just keep replacing them if they die out. Sage is another perennial herb, and this one, my favorite variety is Bergarten, and it is a type of garden sage. The Bergarten is, that was, someone discovered it in an area of Germany that's called Bergarten, and it's slow to flower. So when sages flower, they tend to decline after they've flowered, and so that's one reason we think of cooking sage as not being very long lived in the garden. Is because once it flowers, then the mother plant sort of starts to decline. But the Bergarten rarely flowers, and that, I think that helps it to live longer. And then it also has nice, big, fat, wide leaves, and that's really nice for cooking purposes. Harvesting is you harvest whenever you want. These will overwinter for us, and I really love fresh sage. You just want to, look for the nicest looking leaves and pinch those out for cooking. And growing tips, it really wants full sun. It's going to need good drainage. The salvias, the culinary sage, and other sages are sensitive to some fungal diseases, and so they don't always live a long time in the garden. But this Bergarten one is really reliably long-lived. So if you can get your hands on it, if you would like to come to the kitchen garden, I would be happy to give you a cutting and you can try propagating it yourself. So just come see me at the garden and we can cut you off a little piece of the Bergarten and you can try propagating it for your home garden. Thyme, this is a perennial common herb, and there are a few different types of thyme. There's the English thyme, and that's the most common. And then there's your French. And I think for my palate, the taste is very, very similar. But if you get into reading, you can imagine like French chefs are like, you have to use the French kind for this French recipe. But the flavor differences is pretty subtle. The English lavender can have a little bit of a stronger flavor than the French. And the leaves on the English lavender are slightly larger and a little more rounded. There's also lemon thyme, and it has a really citrus flavor to it and a citrus scent. And harvesting the thyme, it's perennial, so you want to just keep it going in your garden all year long and just pinch off the tips to use for cooking. And it's good to harvest your thyme often because it has the tendency to get really leggy and woody underneath, and so it starts to look kind of funky because it has, and then once it gets woody and leggy, it doesn't grow leaves on the woody portion, and so then you have like this nice green stuff on top, and then you've got these kind of bare, naked woody stems at the bottom. But by trimming it back often, you can sort of slow that process down so you can keep it tidier and a shorter, more compact plant that's not going to have that rangy, sort of messy growth habit. Okay, so those are the specific herbs I wanted to talk about, and now we'll transition into looking at some of the preservation techniques. So this was at the UT Gardens, a volunteer she worked with me on a class, and we collected a whole lot of herbs from the garden and dried them. We're going to look briefly at, hanging bundles, drying them on a screen, oven/dehydrator, microwave technique, freezer techniques, and that's it. So before we go into the preservation techniques, I want to just talk about harvesting in general. Before you harvest to preserve, a few things to keep in mind. It's good to harvest in the morning, and it's best to let the dew evaporate. And so if you can harvest in the morning before the sun has gotten really intense and possibly burned off some of those flavor, the oils that contain the flavor of the herb can get sort of evaporate in the intense sun. So there's a little window there in the morning where you're going to get the most intense flavor, but you want to let some of that dew dry just because you want to keep the moisture down. Then you're going to, well, that doesn't make sense. I said you want to keep the moisture down, but then you're going to rinse the herbs in cool water. That's optional. If it's been raining, I'll leave that up to you if you want to rinse your herbs off. I sometimes pick them from my garden. I've cut them right off the top of the plant. It's rained recently. I might not necessarily wash them, but that's a personal choice. But then if you do wash them, you want to remove the excess moisture, shake them off, and then you want to go through and just pick out any leaves that might look bruised, dead, anything that looks, less than perfect. You just pick those out. And then if you're thinking about harvesting just the leaf, you want to harvest when the plants are mature, but before they've begun to flower. So we talked a little bit about that with basil, that the flowering process can change the flavor of the leaves. So you do want to pay attention to the growth of the plant and know that the flavor is going to be different at different stages of development. And if you're really planning ahead to preserve your herbs, you want to catch your leaves before the plant has gone into flower. And then if you're harvesting flowers like your chamomile or your lavender, it's good to catch those flowers on the first day that they've opened. That's when you're going to get the maximum flavor, rather than waiting for them to, hang around and be a few days older. And then if you're harvesting seeds, the seed heads should be mature and hard, but not yet ready to self-sow. So ready to self-sow means they're fully mature, and if they drop to the ground, they would, sprout. If they have matured to that level, then again, the flavor is going to change. And so you just want to be watching those seeds start to develop and start to mature. And then you want to harvest them when they're fully mature, but not all dried out and brown and really, really dry. Okay, so first method that we'll talk about is hanging bundles, and this is like the old school, I think one of the simplest methods, and it works really well. The few things to know are that you want to keep it out of direct light. So we've talked about the sun evaporating the oils, so you want to dry your herbs not in the direct sun because you're wanting to retain that flavor. Warm, dry air is best, and you do want to provide air circulation. So I dry herbs just hanging up in my kitchen. I think they look really pretty. I just hang them away from the direct light that comes in the window, and not directly over a heat vent or an air conditioning vent, but just off to a side where it's getting natural house air circulation. It's not in my basement. And it's a little protected. And so the hanging bundles is a great method for those sturdier herbs, like your woody herbs, like rosemary, thyme, and sage. And those sturdier herbs, the flavor stands up well to that method. And it can take a few weeks. It can take anywhere from, I'd say, depending on what the ambient temperature of your house is, it could take anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks. So just test your herbs as they're drying, and if they feel the least bit pliable or flexible, then they're not dried. That you want it to crumble and be really crispy in your hand, and that's when you know that it's really, really dry. But you do want to just keep testing it, because once it has become completely dried out, then you want to go ahead and put it into an airtight container. If you just leave it there, leave it, then you will start to lose some of that flavor.
I've got a couple of questions.
Sure.
First is, if I cut the herb but wanted to keep it fresh for a few days, maybe in the fridge and not dry it, what's the best way to keep them fresh once they're cut? Do they need to be kept in water?
Yes. I would say as a general rule, yes. That's what I do. I usually cut them and then I treat them like a little bouquet, and I just put them in fresh water. And just like a bouquet, you want to change your water daily to help keep the herbs fresh. I usually just keep mine on the counter in my kitchen, and they last for a few days. You can also put them in the fridge, and you can put them in a glass of water, and then you can put a plastic bag over them and put them in the fridge, and they'll last for quite a while.
Okay, and the other question is oregano a woody herb?
Good question. I'm gonna say it's not as woody as thyme, lavender, or rosemary. I'm gonna say no, because oregano, it flowers and then all those stems die back, and then usually like cut all the oregano flower stems out, and then you just have the leaves that grow along the ground. And so no, there's no structure that stays woody, all year like a rosemary plant. Does that answer your question? Oregano is more similar to mint in that it's herbaceous, it spreads by runners, it grows close to the ground, and then it goes through its flowering phase, and then you cut those flowers down, and the stems and the leaves at the base of the plant continue to grow.
She said, yes, you answered the question.
Okay, great. All right, so next method to look at is screen drying. And so this can be good for some of your smaller things like chamomile, for example, and that's what we have in this picture here. But it's pretty much the same theory as that you're providing air circulation, you're protecting it from direct sun, and you're just allowing there to be airflow on top of the herb and below the herb, and then the herb is just drying out naturally. So you can use homemade screens like you see in this picture here. This is a herb drying screen that's probably been made specifically for herb drying, and you can there's some fancy, you could build your own rack or you can buy one. They have shelves. Well, the screen is the shelf, so you have like multiple screens in one unit, and so you can dry multiple herbs at the same time in this drying rack. But you could also just use a repurposed window screen if you have one, and you just clean it really, really well. And then you just want to make sure that you set it either on bricks or on something that's going to allow air to circulate underneath it and above it. And then you just want to place your herbs in a single layer, just like you can see in the picture here. You can keep the leaves on the stems. Okay, so this is if you were doing something like, say, oregano, for example, and you lined out all of your stems, and the stems have the leaves growing all up and down them, you could pull all the leaves off at that point and just dry the leaves individually, like we're drying the chamomile flowers in this picture, or you could even just leave the leaves on the stems and just dry them like that, and it'll work just the same. It might take a little bit longer if you leave the leaves on the stem. You want to keep out of direct sunlight. Like I said, provide good air circulation, and then you just wait anywhere from 3 days to a couple weeks, depending on what it is that you're drying out. Next method to look at is the oven. And so this is similar to a dehydrator. It's an easy way to dry herbs because the temperature is controlled. The target temperature for drying herbs in the oven is 140 degrees to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. And most ovens start at about 200. So you do want, meaning the temperature gauge starts at 200, so you can set it at 200, but you can reach those lower temperatures, but your temperature indicator is not going to tell you that it's at that temperature, so you would need to use an internal thermometer. And then you can just crack the door open a tiny bit for good air circulation, and it can take 1 to 4 hours. Check every 30 minutes. So this picture here is some oregano that I dried in my oven a couple days ago, and it smelled wonderful. And after I had left it in for about an hour, it looked like the bottom picture, and so it dried out, I did lose the pretty color, but the scent and the flavor is still really good. It is possible to, if you cook it at too high of a temperature, you're gonna blast your flavor out of there, and you're gonna lose your flavor. And also, if you cook it for too long, you're gonna lose your flavor. So you do want to keep your temperature really low, and you want to check it often. I don't have a slide about the dehydrators, but they're pretty self-explanatory. And it's basically the same as this oven thing. It's just a countertop, machine, and it just has a really low temperature, and it just slowly dries out whatever you put in there. So they can work pretty well. It works. The oven and the dehydrator are going to work better for herbs that have stronger flavors, that are sturdier herbs. So like sage and rosemary are like really strong. The oregano can be pretty strong. So they're good candidates for oven drying. But if you put like basil in the oven and try to dry it like this, the flavor is less stable and it's more mild, and I think you would lose your flavor a lot faster. So the microwave is another method, and this is one that maybe some of you all have tried. I have never used a microwave. My friend Rosemary, this is her slide, and she loves the microwave method. And the key to this, or like why people think, or why it works so well, is because of the way the microwave works, that it targets the water molecules. And so that is what you're trying to dry up. And so the microwave zaps those water molecules and dries them up quickly. And so the thinking is that by drying up the water quickly, you're pulling the water out of the oils that taste good. And so you're, because the process is fast and selective, you're able to retain the flavor really well.
Holly, we have a question about the oven.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, would mint be a good one for the oven?
I would experiment with it. I'm not sure. Yes, I think you could do it in the oven. When I save mint just for mint tea, I just hang it up to dry it. And it works really well just as a hanging bundle. But that said, I think if you keep the temperature down and you check it really often, yes, I think mint would be a good one to try in the oven. It has a good, strong flavor. So the other good thing about the microwave is that it retains the color of the herb. So a lot of these other methods, you lose the nice color. But when you use a microwave, like for this picture here is showing parsley, and you can see down at the bottom how green it is. So that's nice to have that nice green color. So you just want to wash and separate your leaves, lay them out between 2 paper towels, and then you just microwave on high for 60 seconds. And then you go in intervals of 20 seconds until they're dry. And there's some wiggle room there with that, about the duration of the timing, and it will depend on how strong your microwave is. So you may want to just err on the side of safety, and you could even just start with like 30 seconds or 45 seconds, and then go in small numbered increments until it gets that really dry, crispy state that you want. And then once you've let them cool, then you can just put them in an airtight container and put the date on them. You do want to try to use them. It's different depending on how you've dried the herb and depending on what herb it is. But for microwaved herbs like parsley, they're generally good for about a month. But I mean, all we're talking about when we say good is flavor. So they start to lose their flavor the older they are, but you can just smell it and taste it and see if it still has any flavor. And if it doesn't, then you know it's past its prime. So we made an Italian blend, and in the class that we taught a couple years ago, and I loved it. It's amazing. I really recommend it. And all it is just taking all these nice herbs: rosemary, oregano, thyme, sage, and marjoram, in any any amount. It's just 1 to 1 to 1 to 1. How, same amount of each. And you're going to dry each one, using whichever method you want. And then you're just going to crush them all together. And it is, okay, we did like a taste test. So you see on the right where you've got this Robertson's, the Spice People, and, all the different brands that we have at the stores. We bought a fresh bottle of Italian herb blend from the store, and then we made the homemade Italian blend, and then we tasted the two side by side, and it was really staggering how much more flavor there was in the homemade blend, just because it's fresh. It just makes all the difference in the world for it to be fresh, even if it's freshly dried, because you don't have any idea how long the stuff at the store has been on the shelf, what its history was. But if you get it from your garden, you dry it for yourself, and you mix it up yourself, that it's fresh, and you can really taste the difference. And in general, you want to get fresh dried herbs like once a year. So every season you should be getting rid of the herbs that you've dried the previous year, and you should be starting with your your current year's stock, and that's how you're really going to get the best flavor. And 1 teaspoon of dried herbs equals about 4 teaspoons of fresh herbs. So the flavor is really intensified when you dry the herbs. And if you're if you're cooking with them and the recipe calls for fresh and you only have dried, just know that you're going to want to use less of the fresh. You want to use less of the dried, because the dried herb is going to be stronger than the fresh herb. So storing dried herbs, you want to use an airtight container. These little jelly jars work great. If you're drying your own herbs and you put them in the container and you start to see a little bit of condensation inside there, you know that they weren't dried out enough, and you're going to need to toss that whole batch, because you'll start to get some mold in there. So you just want to start over. And like I said, in general, they're going to have about a 1-year shelf life. Okay, so moving on from dried herbs, we're going to look a little bit at a few other methods. You can freeze individual leaves, and this is really simple. There are modifications to this, and different people have different recommendations. The standard recommendation is to blanch your leaves first, which means submerge them in really hot water for a few seconds and then immediately submerge them in freezing cold water. And all that really does is it makes them keep their color. But flavor-wise, it doesn't really make a big difference. So, and if you're cooking with the herbs, like basil, for example, if you're going to be putting it in like a tomato sauce, you're not going to be able to see that green color anyway, because it's going to be cooked, and once you cook it, it's going to turn brown. So if you want to go through the trouble to blanch them, you can, but I've had really good success just rinsing the leaves off, allowing them to dry, and then freezing them just like that. So you just want to line a cookie sheet with wax paper, lay your chopped or whole leaves in a single layer. So if you want to pre-chop them, you can, or you can just lay them out fresh. And then you're going to freeze overnight, and really that's 12 to 24 hours. And then you're going to place them in Ziploc bags, and you do want to be, you want to have your Ziploc bag ready. So you pull your leaves out of the freezer, and then you want to get them into your Ziploc bag really quickly, because they're so thin, they start to defrost really, really quickly. So you want to be prepared to just get them into your freezer bag right away. And then you just mark your freezer bag with what they are, and those will stay good for 6 months to a year in the freezer. And then when you're ready to use them, you could just pull them out individually and rip them up or chop them up and use them just like you would a fresh herb. Another option, and this one is really great for soups, is to do, you could chop up fresh herbs and you could do like a blend of, you know, thyme and parsley and whatever you like, blend them all together first, and then you can place in ice cube trays, and then you just fill the rest of the way up with water, and you freeze it for a few hours until it's frozen, and then you're going to place an additional little layer of water on top of that, and then freeze it again, because the herbs tend to float to the surface on that first freeze, and you really want to get them encapsulated in that frozen water. So after the first freeze, you add another layer of water, and then you stick them back in the freezer again. Then you can just place those finished cubes excuse me, in a sealed plastic bag and keep them in the freezer, and then you can just pull them out individually and add them to all different kinds of recipes. Another option for freezing is to do frozen herb butter. This is delicious. But it's super easy, and you're just gonna chop up a lot of your fresh herbs like parsley, dill, or basil, and then you're just gonna mix those into butter. And so first you have to kind of soften the butter a little bit and, you know, mash it up and make it to where it can receive the herbs. But you sort of blend up your butter. You can use a fork to get it to a nice consistency, and then you just put your chopped herbs in there. And then you shape it into a roll like you see on the right, and you can either like be really fancy that day and serve it immediately, or you can wrap it in plastic wrap and freeze it, and then you can just cut off chunks as you need them for herb butter or for baking. Okay, so that is all I have on preservation. There's just a few different methods that you can try out. And then the last part, I want to end on a sweet note. So I want to talk a little bit about this herb, Stevia rebaudiana, which is the sweet herb. And it is a tender perennial from South America. And you may have seen this as a alternative sweetener. It's pretty common in stores, but you can grow it yourself. It's really easy to grow, and it contains no sugar. I feel like I'm doing a commercial, but I'm pretty excited about stevia because it's a great way to get a sweet flavor, and it's so easy to grow, and it has 0 sugar, and it's got 0 calories. So it's awesome. We grow it in the garden every year at UT, and we love having the kids come through the garden because we give them stevia leaves, and they love it. It's like sweet in their mouth and really delicious. But you can use it as a sugar-free sweetener for all kinds of baking and for drinks. So one nice thing to do is to dry it, and then you make a powder with it. So you can put it in a coffee grinder, and you can see the top picture on this slide just shows the coffee grinder with the fresh leaves in the top left. I'm sorry, the dried leaves, the uncrushed dried leaves in the top left. And then you're just gonna zap it up, grind it up in the coffee maker, and then you just put that in a jar, and it will keep for a really long time. And you can use it as a substitute for sugar, or you can use it as an addition to sugar, so that you can use a little bit less sugar. And that's how I usually like to use it. Like cut my sugar for a recipe maybe by a quarter, and just substitute a little bit of stevia for that missing sugar. And so I've just cut my calories, cut my sugar intake, but it still tastes sweet because I add the stevia. You can also do a liquid stevia concentrate, and this is basically just like a tea that you make. And the way you do that is to do fresh stevia. You chop it up, and then you can add it to hot water, to boiling water, and then you're going to pour that water. So you're going to bring the water to boil, and then you're going to pour the hot water over the leaves, and then you're going to let it steep for 24 hours. So you make a really, really, really strong tea, and then you can put that in ice cube trays and use those individually, or you can just put it in a container and keep it in your fridge. It will only last for about 2 weeks in your refrigerator because it is just like any tea. But if you put it in the freezer, it will last longer. I didn't put directions for this on here, but there's also a way to make an alcohol-based stevia concentrate, and it's super easy. And I'll just tell you, basically you take either dried leaves or fresh leaves, you put them in a jar, and then you pour a nice vodka over it, or some other type of, alcohol that doesn't have a strong flavor. And then you let that sit for 24 hours, and then you strain out the leaves, and you get this green liquid, and then you can you simmer that for like 20 minutes, and that evaporates off the alcohol. And then you have this alcohol-based stevia concentrate that you can keep in the refrigerator for as long as 6 months. And you can use that as for liquids as a natural sweetener, a natural no calorie sweetener. Some people don't like the taste of stevia, so if you've never tried it, just give it a try, and then try these different methods at preserving it, and try it in a lot of these different ways, because just because you tasted it once and didn't like it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't like some of these other preparations. Because I noticed that the fresh stevia that I dried from my garden didn't have the same bitter flavor that I've noticed from some of the stevia drops that I bought at the store before. It had a more mellow flavor. So I recommend you try some of these different methods. So if you do use stevia in baking or some other recipes, do be aware that it changes the texture. So the sugar, the bulk of the sugar, affects the ultimate recipe when it comes to baking. And so you use such a small amount of stevia that can be tricky to get the right texture from your baked goods. So you do have to be careful with that and do a little research to make sure that you're making up for that, the bulk of that sugar, by adding something like, applesauce or some other amendment. But you can see here on this little table that 1 cup of sugar is going to be equal to, in flavor wise and sweetness, in the intensity of sweetness, 1 cup of sugar would be equivalent to like 1 teaspoon of the powdered stevia, or 1 teaspoon of the liquid concentrate stevia. So it is powerful stuff, but it's fun to grow. It's easy to grow by propagating. It's common in the stores. You can find it usually at any of garden centers. We'll start to have it now. It's a tropical perennial, so it does like the warm weather. But give it a try, and you can enjoy sugar-free natural sweetener from your garden. All right, that is all I have for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer questions. If you think of something later that you would like help with garden-wise, please feel free to email me. My email is right there. And that's it.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, Holly and PJ. Great job.
All right. Thanks.
Take care.
All right, you too.